In this lesson, we are going to factor trinomials by using the method of decomposition. The format we are using today has a as being a number other than 1, okay? So it's something that's not 1. So look at our example at the bottom. Notice there is a 3 in front of the x squared. That's not a 1. So these are the kind of problems we're going to be dealing with today. Now, when you have a question like this, you're going to find two numbers whose sum is the b. So b is the middle term right beside the x. So on the bottom side, that would be this -5 right over here. So you're basically going to find two numbers that add up to -5. Now, those same two numbers should have a product of a and c. So remember, a is the number beside the x squared, and c is the constant, the number by itself. So you're also finding those same two numbers should multiply to the first one and the last one. So in this case, they should multiply to 3 times -2, which is -6. Okay, so let's just review that once again. When you're finding problems like this, you start up by finding two numbers that add up to the middle one, in this case -5, and those same two numbers should multiply to the 3 and the -2, meaning -6. Okay, so that's how we're always going to start the problems. So let's actually do a couple of questions. On to our first question. Now, you know we have to find two numbers that add up to the middle number, which is -7. And those same two numbers should multiply to the a, meaning the number beside x squared, and the c, meaning the number by itself. So 6 times -5 is -30. So really two numbers that add up to -7 and multiply to -30. Now, I always like to figure out what two numbers multiply to the -30. So let's do that one first. Now let's try 6 times -5. Well, yeah, that comes to -30. But 6 minus 5 comes to 1, and that's not our middle term. So let's think of other numbers. What about 3 times 10? Now, our answer should be a negative. So what if we made the 10 a negative? Let's try that. So 3 times -10 is -30. And 3 minus 10, well, that happens to be -7, which is our middle term. So our numbers are +3 and -10. Let's write that down. Okay, now that we have that, the second step would be to decompose the middle term. So what you do is you leave the 6x squared as it is, but the middle term, the -7x, gets decomposed to the numbers you came up with. So the numbers we have are 3 and -10. I'm going to write that down. So this is going to be +3x. Now, it's important that you write the x because the middle term had an x and you're decomposing it. Now, the other number was -10, and don't forget the x. So these two, if you notice, they do add up to -7. So really, your question is the same. You just decomposed it. That's all. Okay, and then don't forget the -5 at the end. Okay, so this is the second step. Now, the third step, we are going to do factor by grouping. So we're going to group two at a time. So I'm going to group these two, and I'm going to factor that first. Okay, so we've got 6 and 3. The greatest common factor between 6 and 3 would have to be 3, because it can be divided by both without giving you a decimal. But notice both of them also have an x, so you have to take the x out with the smallest exponent, which is just a plain x. Okay, so we have our greatest common factor, put a bracket, and now we're going to divide each term by the 3x. So 6x squared divided by 3x is 2x. Okay, on to the next one. 3x divided by 3x is +1. Okay, close the bracket, and now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so we're going to factor those two, and notice there's a negative out, so I'm going to factor that out. Okay, let's focus on the coefficients. So we've got 10 and 5. A number that can be divided by 10 and 5 would be 5. And that's the biggest one we can come up with. Now, this one has an x, but the other one doesn't, so you cannot take the x out. So really, 5 is our greatest common factor. Now, let's divide each of these by the -5 that we took out. So -10x divided by -5 is 2x, and -5 divided by -5 is +1. Now, hopefully you're noticing something here. We are now going to factor the binomials. So both of these terms actually have a common factor, which is 2x plus 1 in the bracket. So we're going to factor that out first. So let's write that. 2x plus 1 in a bracket And then we're going to take the leftovers and put them in a separate bracket. So now we've got 3x minus 5 in a separate bracket. And this right here is our answer. Now, as always, you can check to see if your answer is actually correct. So let's do the check. And this involves multiplying it all out. So let's do that. 2x times 3x is 6x squared. Then 2x times negative 5 is negative 10x. Okay, now it's the ones turn. So 1 times positive 3x is positive 3x. And 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. Now if you notice, we've got like terms, so we have to simplify that. Leave the 6x squared, and negative 10 plus 3 is negative 7. Don't forget the x, and then the negative 5. Now look at this. Our answer for the check is basically the same as the original question. That means that your answer is actually correct. So our final answer is bracket 2x plus 1, close the bracket, and then bracket 3x minus 5. This question, we are going to start off the same way. We're going to find two numbers that add up to the middle term, which is positive 30. So let's write that down. And those same two numbers should multiply to the first and the last term. So that would be 7 times 8, which is positive 56. Okay, so let's write that. So I always start off with finding two numbers that multiply to 56. So in this case, let's try, well, 7 times 8 won't work, but what about 2 times 28? Yep, 2 times 28 is 56, and then 2 plus 28 actually comes to 30, which is our middle term. So our numbers are 2 and 28. Okay, so let me just write that down here so I don't forget. Now the second step would be to decompose the middle term with those two numbers we came up with. So we're going to leave the 7x squared as it is, but the 30x is going to be decomposed with our two numbers. So one of the numbers was 28 and the other was 2. So let's write that down. And they were both positive. So positive 28, but don't forget there's an x in the middle term, so we have to put that there, and then plus 2x. And then leave the 8 as it is. Okay, so that part is done. Now the third step was to factor by grouping. So again, you're going to group two at a time. So let's group these two first. Now the common factor between 7 and 28, like something we can divide without getting a decimal, would have to be 7. Okay, now this has an x squared and that one has an x, so you're going to take the x with the smallest exponent, which is just x. Okay, so now our greatest common factor is there, so let's divide everything by 7x. So 7x squared divided by 7x is x, and 28x divided by 7x is just positive 4. Okay, now we close the bracket. All right, now let's move on to the other two, and let's factor these two together. So there's a positive here. I'm going to take the positive out, and a number that can be divided by 2 and 8, well, the biggest one would have to be 2. Now this one has an x, but the other one doesn't, so can't take out any x's. Okay, greatest common factor is 2. All right, so now let's close the bracket and divide both of them by 2. So 2x divided by 2 is just x, and then positive 8 divided by positive 2 is just positive 4. Close the bracket. And now we are going to factor the binomials. So both of these terms actually have a common factor of x plus 4. So let's factor that out. So in a bracket, we're going to write x plus 4. Now the leftovers, the 7x and the 2, we're going to put in a separate bracket. So 7x plus 2, close the bracket, and here is our final answer. Here is our last question, and we're going to start off the same way. We're going to find two numbers that add up to the middle term, which happens to be positive 2. So let's write that down. And those same two numbers should multiply to 3, and there's no number beside the y, so remember that's actually a 1. So two numbers that multiply to 3 times negative 1, which is negative 3. Okay, so let's write that down. They should multiply at a -3. So actually, let's find that out. So two numbers that multiplied at -3, that would be 3 times -1. Yeah, that comes to -3. But let's see if it works when you add it. -3 minus 1, yeah, that comes to +2. So our two numbers are 3 and -1. Okay, so now the second step, we are going to decompose the middle term with the numbers that we just came up with. So we are going to leave the 3x squared as it is, and the 2xy is going to get decomposed with the -3 and the 1. So let's write the -3. Now beside that, you have to write an xy because you are decomposing the middle term, which has an xy. And the other number was +xy. Now you can also just write it as xy. It's the same thing as 1xy. Okay, and now let's write the -y squared. Okay, second step is done. Now for step 3, we are going to do factor by grouping. So let's group 2 at a time. Now the first one, let's look at the 3 and the 3. So the biggest number that can be divided by 3 without giving you a decimal is 3. Now both of the terms also have an x. So you're going to take the x with the smallest exponent, which is just the plain x. Now the first term does not have a y, so you cannot take the y out. So 3x is your common factor. Now let's divide 3x squared divided by 3x is just plain x. Okay, now -3xy divided by 3x is -y. Close the bracket. Now let's go on to factor the other two. Because there's a positive out here, I'm going to take that out. And a common factor between both of them happens to be y, because they both have a y. So take the one with the smallest exponent, which is just the plain y. Okay, close the bracket. And now let's divide both terms by the y. So +xy divided by y is just +x. And -y squared divided by y is just -y. And close the bracket. Now the last step, we are going to factor the binomials. So both of these terms have a common factor of x minus y. So let's factor that out. So let's write that equals bracket x minus y. And then the leftovers, which is 3x plus y, we're going to put in a separate bracket. So 3x plus y, and then close this bracket. So this right here is our final answer.